All right, so we're going to start part two of our lesson on Antiquity to contemporary persecution in the Christian church. Today we've got Peyton with us, and Peyton, anytime you want to interject, just say something. So looking forward to it. I think this is going to be a good lesson. I think it's going to be edifying. So let's get into it. So first thing we want to look at is we followed up last week Domitian, and we're looking at these emperors that were really difficult, painful, sadistic, murderous to the early Christian church. And we're looking at how they responded. And if you remember the three things, the ways that they responded with they focused on the Great Commission. They focused on converts and disciples. They focused on the miraculous presence of God in the midst of the persecution, and they focused on that koinonia with Christ, the fellowship with Christ and His suffering. And the reason they did that is because of the future glory, that promise that we have future glory. This lesson is definitely going to develop on that, and you're going to see why here shortly. So we're looking at Emperor Trajan. Emperor Trajan is kind of, there's something here that's foundational to everything else we're going to talk about for the rest of these lessons. And what that is that Emperor Trajan actually issued an edict. Now, he was an emperor at 112 AD. If you remember last time, we were wrapping up at about 100 AD. And so we're only a little bit forward. He was emperor for about 5 years. But what's very interesting here is that there was this governor. His name was Pliny the Younger, and he was the governor over, I'm going to tell you the name of it. Well, I'll just say it's the modern day country of Turkey. And it's kind of hard for us to realize why Turkey is significant. Like, why Turkey? Like, what happened in Turkey? Well, let's go back historically and biblically, and I'm going to mention a couple of names, and they're probably going to jump right out. So have you ever heard of Troy? Have you ever heard of Ephesus? So these places are in modern day Turkey. Also, we know the capital of Turkey is Istanbul. Well, Istanbul historically is Constantinople. Constantinople is the city that Constantine built as the new capital for the Roman Empire. So this is the setting for this story we're going to get into and why it's so significant. Pliny the Elder was actually over a city called Bithynia. And Bithynia, if you want to wonder why this is even more significant that this letter was written, if you ever heard of the Nicene Creed. The Nicene Creed is what happened when Constantine stepped up, and there was a controversy in the Christian church. The Christian church was finally freed from persecution, and we're going to get to that later on. But there was this guy Arius who was a bishop, and he was stirring up this controversy that Jesus was created. He was not co-equal with God. When we say the Son of God, it was just like the son Adam being the Son of God. That he was a created being for the purpose of creating everything else. Now, he was very much enriched in Scripture, but he was wrong. And the other bishops in the church came together, about 300 of them. They had a meeting at Nicaea, and at Nicaea they came out with a decision. It was 300 and to just a handful. It was actually over 300. And they basically said that Jesus is homoousios, which is he is of the same substance of God the Father. So he is God and the Son of God. And that's where our story takes place 200 years before that whole council came together, before the Nicene Creed was developed, is in Bithynia. And so in Bithynia, there was a situation, and so we kind of wonder, was Christianity catching on in the Roman Empire? We finished in Acts in Rome. And so, well, here we are over in Bithynia, which is in modern-day Turkey. It's in the northern part of Turkey, quite a ways from Rome if we look at a map. I mean, this is a little ways away, but we also know that we have letters to Ephesus. So there was local churches. We have our letter to Ephesians, that is in our Bible. So these local churches were popping up. And the governor had a situation. He had two big things going on that he wanted to deal with. And if you ever want to learn where things are going, you just follow the money. And you're going to see what I mean here. So he writes this letter to Emperor Trajan, and he says, look, I had to put these two women that were ministers, we had to put these two female Christians to torture, and I really don't know how to deal with this situation because they don't want to be pagans, they don't want to recant their beliefs, so I tortured them, they stuck where they were. So, yes, it is significant that they were women, and they were tortured, and they were Christians. But he's writing because that wasn't his dilemma, that they were women, that they were Christians, and they were tortured. That wasn't his dilemma. His dilemma that he writes about is two things. He says, number one, the pagan temples are deserted. And you think, oh man, Pliny the Elder, he must be very religious. He must be very high-minded. He really loves the pagan temples. No, remember I said follow the money. The problem was the pagan temples are deserted, meaning that the people that sell animals to do animal sacrifices don't have any customers. And Pliny the Elder tells us the problem here, Pliny the Younger. I'm sorry if I said Pliny the Elder, but it's Pliny the Younger. Pliny the Younger says the problem was that there was too many Christians in his region, and nobody was going to the pagan temples anymore, and nobody was buying pagan sacrifices. So now they've got all these guys that sell these sacrifices that are coming to him and saying, need you to do something because we don't make any money anymore. What does this sound like? This sounds like Paul back in Acts when he went to the city. And this is so cool. I'm going to grab my Bible and I'm going to look back in Acts chapter, give me 1 minute. Because we kind of talked about this last time. So if you remember back when he was in Ephesus in Acts 19, just talked about this. We're still in the modern day country of Turkey where Ephesus is. And there was a riot because people were not going and buying or going to the temple either. The statues of Artemis, the goddess Artemis, they were not visiting the pagan temple. And there was a riot, and they wanted to kill Paul. So here we are again in the same circumstances again. So why is that a big deal? We already have read about it in Acts. This is what happens when Christians go into a place. What's a big deal is Trajan issues an edict. Trajan, his edict, and I'm not going to go into all the verbiage. I want to get to the key part of it, and then I'm going to speak to Tertullian, because right now you see Tertullian has this statement here, and I want to give you some context to that statement. Tertullian wrote that statement, if you remember last time, he wrote that statement about 100 years later. So, we're talking about a century later he wrote it, but he's looking back on this edict because it was still affecting the guys 100 years later. So, the edict, it was supposedly progressive. Trajan says we're very progressive people today, and since we're such a progressive people, he says this. He says that when it comes to the punishment of Christians, there is no general rule that is equally valid in all circumstances. Okay, what does that mean? There's no general rule. Well, it means basically they're not breaking any laws. What? Okay, well that basically says, well, okay, just let them go free. Don't bother, don't antagonize these people. And so let's keep getting into this and see what's going on. So then he says this. He says, when it comes to Christians, there's no general rule that is equally valid in all circumstances. So, on the one hand, the nature of their crime is such that the state should not waste time seeking them out. Well, if the state's not going to seek them out, have they done a crime? So let's keep reading. On the other hand, if they are accused and refuse to recant, they should be punished. So here's where Tertullian is criticizing that statement, and that edict became the foundational. This is like when something happens in the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court doesn't write law, they interpret law. So now, basically, Trajan has now put out this interpretation, he's put out this law, but it's also the interpretation of the law. And he's sending it to Pliny the Younger, and this is where Tertullian is really from his legal mindset. So remember, Tertullian was a lawyer, and he's saying Trajan refuses to seek them out as though they're innocent, and order that they must be punished as though they are guilty. It pardons and yet is cruel. So what happens here is that now, in essence, Christians are now a political prisoner. What that means is they're not punished for a crime like we'd say today. If you bring someone to court, we'd say, well, they're innocent before they're innocent until proven guilty. This is different. They're innocent into the courtroom when the courtroom says, okay, now we need you to worship to the pagan idol, and they say, we don't do that. If you bring us a Bible, if you bring us, back then it would have been the scriptures, or if you tell us that we can do that in response to our God, which is holding us to a higher standard of truth that you even hold to, they said, no, you don't understand. We only set a pagan God. That's the only option you have here. And so the moment they show up at the trial, now they are punished for which basically, as Justo Gonzalez puts it, is they were punished for contempt of court. That's the issue, is they're being punished for contempt of court. They're not being punished for an actual crime. And we're going to talk some of that punishment. So we see this statement, like I said, this is foundational to the rest of this entire presentation. And let me bring that back up again. And so one of the biggest named martyrs during this period was Ignatius. Ignatius was the bishop of Syria. More particularly, he was the bishop of Antioch. Antioch is where we first hear that believers are called Christians. Before that, they were being called Jews because they believed we are the fulfillment of Judaism. So we talked about before, Christ came not to abolish the law, but to fulfill the law. So they said, yeah, we are Jews. But then there became like some confusion, and they were bringing Greeks in there, and they were saying, hey, there really is no distinction between your heritage, Jewish heritage, or your Greek heritage, because in Christ we're all one. In Galatians we have the statement that there is neither Greek nor Scythian nor barbarian, male nor female, slave nor free. We're in Christ, we're all one. We see that concept through Paul's letters. We see the concept in John 15 of oneness with Christ. So Ignatius' name means literally the bearer of God. And Ignatius, this is a hard statement you're looking at. If you're looking at the screen right now and reading this slide, this is a very hard statement to digest. But let me give you some background here, and to do that, I'm going to kind of go full screen here because I think it might help just seeing a little better. So I'm going to read from this letter. So what happened is Ignatius is in Antioch, and obviously because he is a sold-out Christian, he is the bishop of Antioch, he is experiencing some serious persecution from the people of Antioch. And they're really falling in line with this edict. Even before the edict was really formalized throughout the Roman Empire, they were kind of using the same principle still floating around. And they accused him of all these things. He's pointing out heresies within the pagan religion that would be heretical for Christians to be part of. They're like Paul did. He showed up in Athens and he said, hey, you got all these gods. Well, in the past, God forgave that ignorance. Today, that's over. There's no forgiveness of that ignorance. God is preaching the gospel to you today. But then he was also preaching, there was heretical teaching starting to pop up in Antioch as well, in the Christian church. And he was dealing with that. So he had enemies on all sides. They accused him of being a heretic to the pagan religion, and they sentenced him to execution. How pivotal was he is that he actually, well, I'm going to hold off on that for a minute, but I just want you to understand who Ignatius is. Historically, tradition tells us that Ignatius and then another disciple who became his disciple named Polycarp. Ignatius and Polycarp were disciples of John the Apostle. Let that sink in. This is a disciple of John the Apostle. Okay? So let's kind of unpack what happened on his way to Rome for his punishment. On the way to Rome, he sends out 7 letters. And those 7 letters, we're going to focus in on one of them, but they were to encourage and edify the churches. I want to keep in the same theme we're in with Rome. Paul ends up in Rome, writes letters from Rome. We go to Romans, Acts ends in Rome. We got done talking about Nero. We got done talking about Domitian. Now Nero, he had this thing he was trying to deal with the fire. He put it on the Christians and he persecuted them because of that. Domitian had this other thing where he was just a very harsh, overbearing tyrant, and he really laid on his own family, even if they're Christian. So he obviously laid it on the Christian church. But we're in Trajan's situation. He puts out this progressive edict that he's saying, hey, don't be like Nero where he went and looked for the Christians. Don't be like Domitian where he was just a tyrant. But if they show up in your courts, tell them to sacrifice the cause, and if they don't, persecute them. And go beyond that, punish them. So let that sink in. So this is the situation and the historical background that Ignatius is. And I really would like to focus more on Ignatius' story for edification for us and for us to take some picture on how we should deal with persecution. And going back to those 3 points we talked about last time, by focusing on the gospel, focusing on the Great Commission, on converts and disciples, number 1. Number 2, to focus on God's miraculous presence in the midst of that persecution. And number 3, to focus on the sharing, the koinonia, the fellowship with Christ in suffering, Romans 8:17, to also focus in on His glory. That third point is going to just flow out of this letter. So this letter was written to the Church of Rome, and I'm going to read through it, and then I'm going to ad-lib some historical situation as I go through it. But I want to stay very faithful to the letter. So he says, the bishop of Syria, talking about who he is, worthy to be sent from the east unto the west, and to become a martyr in behalf of his own precious sufferings. Whoa, his own precious sufferings. Now he's literally saying the exact sentiment of Romans 8:17, that we are sharing with Christ in His sufferings. This comes even more clear. He says this, so as to pass from the world to God, that I may rise unto Him. That's exactly what we looked at before, and we talked about, again, you see him here, and we're going to talk more about this picture here that I'm showing, but that's exactly what we talked about in Romans 8:17. So to pass from the world, that I may rise to Him. If you remember, Romans 8:17 said we are heirs with God and co-heirs with Christ if we suffer with Him, and to be glorified with Him. That our reward, that our expectation is going to be to share in His glorification. This is exactly what Ignatius is writing here. And so, starting to unpack this, he says these words. He said, write to all the churches. So there is churches in Rome. There's churches that are popping up. So this is something we can extrapolate from this letter. Write to all the churches and impress on them all that I shall willingly die for God. He was not avoiding execution. Let's unpack that some. He says that I shall willingly die for God unless ye hinder me. I beseech you not to show an unseizable goodwill toward me. What is he saying there? He's saying, when he says, don't hinder me, I beseech you, I'm urging you not to show goodwill to you. He's saying, I acknowledge you love me, I acknowledge you want to do something for me, because there was a plot to free Ignatius. And he is looking at them and saying, I know you love me and you don't want to see me go to this execution. You don't want to see me go through these horrible things. But I'm urging you not to carry out that plot. Why? Because he says, I willingly die for God unless you keep me from dying for God, from carrying out your plot to free me. How serious is he about willing to die for God? First off, he tells his friends, don't do this. Actually, he was actually sure that they could save him. I'm going to read something he wrote to them. He wrote these words. This is in Justo Gonzalez's book, and he says these words, Ignatius does. He says, "I fear your kindness, which may harm me. You may be able to achieve what you plan. But if you pay no heed to my request, it will be very difficult for me to attain to God." He's telling them, hey, I believe that you can do this, but I'm not going to achieve what I'm really seeking here. He is really seeking something in the midst of persecution, and this is serious persecution, and I'll tell you how serious it was. He says this, he says, "I am the wheat of God." That sounds very poetic. He does not mean to be poetic. I'll explain what I mean. He says, "I am the wheat of God, and am ground by the teeth of wild beasts, that I may be found the pure bread of God." He's saying it's going to be in my execution at the hands of murderers that use animals to tear me from part to part, that animals are chewing on me, that I am going to be purified for heaven. Now tell me, where do we find that today in our context? Where do we find this willingness for suffering, that's going to purify us and prepare us to meet Christ? Let me keep going. "Rather entice the wild beast, which they may become my tomb." And check this out what he says. "And may leave nothing of my body, so that when I have fallen asleep in death, I may not be found troublesome to anyone." He's saying, I hope that they totally consume my body. These animals leave nothing, that you can't even bury me, that I have nothing on this earth that's going to bring me glory. I don't have a tomb. I don't have a nice marker on the ground. I don't have some beautiful words written in granite. I have nothing. And I'll explain more as I go through this letter to unpack that. He says, "Then I shall be a true disciple of Jesus Christ, when the world shall not see so much as my body. Entreat the Lord for me, that by these instruments I may be found a sacrifice to God." And this is hard to swallow. This is hard to swallow. When we think of Romans 12:1, "I urge you therefore, brothers, to present yourselves as a living sacrifice by the mercies of God." Then he goes on to say, this is your reasonable act of worship unto God. This is, and literally in the Greek, this is your logical act of worship. Some translations say this is your spiritual act of worship, but the word is logical. It's building off that logos. And here it is. He's saying, "Entreat the Lord for me, that by these instruments, wild beasts eating him, I may be found a sacrifice to God." Again, that he is pure and he is everything God desires for him to be. I want to keep going. He says this. He says, "May I enjoy the wild beasts that are prepared for me, and pray that I may be found that they may be found eager to rush upon me, which also I will entice them to devour me speedily, and not deal with me as some who out of fear they have not touched." There's a lot to unpack in that statement. I think that would be better for maybe some small group on the side discussion to follow up afterward. Why would he say that? There's some more stuff to unpack. But let me just kind of go forward. He says, "But if they are unwilling to assail me, I will compel them to do so." So he's saying, look, if the beast won't touch me, then I'm going to make sure they touch me. And let me just touch real quickly on that. Where that comes from is that if you look at Paul when he went to Malta, at least that's the word in most of our translations, the island he went to, Malta. It may not have been that island, actually. But when he went there, he was bit by a viper. And then the viper comes off of him. And he doesn't die from it. There is many recorded things in the early church of animals that were put out to attack Christians. And we think of this with Daniel, is our biblical reference here. The lions would not touch Daniel. They would not rush upon Daniel and kill Daniel. And he's saying the opposite. I'm going to entice those animals to come get me. I want them to come get me because I want to be a pure sacrifice for God. I mean, this is difficult to swallow, but he's about to explain why he has this attitude. It's not some masochist attitude. And here he goes into, he says, "Pardon me in this, I know what is for my benefit." And here's what his words. He says, "Now I begin to be a disciple, and have no desire after attaining visible or invisible, that I may attain to Jesus Christ." He's embracing martyrdom, is what he's doing. He's saying, if this is a gift that God has given me to be a witness and die for him, I don't want to shy away from that. I don't want to run from that. I need to embrace that. And I can't embrace that if I'm hiding, or if I'm scared of the animals, or if I say, I hope they don't come eat me, and then something else happens. His attitude is, if this is how God has chosen me to die, I am going to embrace the sovereign will of God. And he goes on, he says, "Let fire and the cross, let the crowds of wild beasts, let breakings, tearings, separations of bones, let cutting off of members, let bruising to pieces of the whole body, let the very torment of the devil come upon me. Only let me attain to Jesus Christ." Now, how many of us would say those words? Especially, let the very torment of the devil come upon me. Again, he is submitting himself to the sovereignty of God here. He's saying, God, if you've chosen for me to die as a witness, as a martyrio, which is where we get the word martyr, it's just the Greek word for witness, martyrio, help me to embrace that. I'm saying help me, but he's gone past that. Now God has helped him. He has embraced that. He has embraced martyrdom. And this is hard to digest, I'll be honest. But listen to this next statement. He says, "Permit me to be an imitator of the Passion of Christ, my God." We watch the movie The Passion of Christ, and we think, wow, look what Jesus went through. Look at the pain he dealt with. But we don't ever walk away and say, permit me to be an imitator of that. Because the true passion of Christ was not the cross. The true passion of Christ was the wrath of God. That was the cup that he was in the garden saying, Lord, take from me. And that cup, if you read in the Psalms, is the pouring out of God's wrath. You should look that up. Look up the cup and what it really meant. The cup, when he looked in the cup, he wasn't seeing the cross. He was seeing the pouring out of God's wrath, as which God took on our behalf. That's what Jesus Christ saved us from. Many Christians have put a cross on their back and died on a cross. Jesus didn't come to save us from crosses and dying. 10 out of 10 people still die today. He came to deal with eternal torment, the wrath of God. That's the eternal life he gave us, that we will live forever. After we pass from this body, we will live forever. The concept of falling asleep is a reality. Let's keep going. So, stand by one moment. Let me pause right there. Peyton, any questions, feedbacks thus far?
No, not really at the moment.
Do you think that this letter is the sentiment of very many believers in the Christian church today, especially here in America?
I wouldn't think so. I'm just kind of saying, like, I want to be a martyr. I want to go even farther than being a martyr almost.
Yes. And again, he was a disciple of the Apostle John. So a lot of us would say, well, I'm a disciple of John. I read John. I love the Gospel of John. The Gospel of John is a gospel of love. But for some reason, when it comes to martyrdom, we kind of pull back and we say, whoa, but I don't know about that. But if we look at this letter and where we are today, I would say he is fully focused upon converts and disciples. He says, spread this to all the churches. He is fully focused on the miraculous presence of God. He's saying, look, bring hell itself upon me. I mean, when I'm saying that in the context of bring the devil upon me, which we know the devil doesn't run hell. God created hell for the devil. But he says, bring even the devil upon me. So he's focused on the miraculous presence of God. If God's sovereign, he's going to take me through anything. And then he's focused upon sharing in the suffering of Christ and the future glory of Christ. Does that resonate with you, those three things, as I read this letter? Hey, Paige?
Yeah, sorry. I wasn't sure if that was a question for the recorded audience.
Well, it's for you.
I'm starting to see how they, how each statement becomes more, I don't know if fulfilled is the right word, but accurate maybe. So I'm getting that.
Yeah, it's not easy to digest. I'll be honest. This is not an easy letter to digest, but it gives us a lot of perspective about how the early church operated and how they embraced these suffering. Let's kind of talk about the current events right now and the riots and things. I haven't seen any rioters run around saying, I'm here to suffer for the name of Christ. I'm here to be a witness, and if that means suffering, I'm okay with suffering. I see the opposite. I see them causing suffering. I see them causing issues. I see them saying, hey, you may not know this, but I'm a Christian, and look at all my compromise, and look at all the destruction I'm causing. Look at all the drama that I'm part of. I see that aspect. I'm not seeing this embracing disciples and converts, embracing that God's miraculous presence will bring you through anything, even if that means you will die. What's that?
You may want to look to some of the policemen then.
Well, I'll hand it to you there. That's a great point. So we do see it, the police that are still showing up for these riots, even though they know they're the targets, right? And I think we can show a lot of respect for them, whereas the other side that are saying that they're rioting for injustice, maybe they're really not rioting for the right definition of injustice. Maybe their definition of injustice, their definite, and Charles and I were talking about this earlier. I know he really wanted to be here for this, but he's on a plane right now. That we were talking about what's the right definition of injustice, and if your passion for injustice is birthed out of your Christian faith, you're going to deal with it a lot differently than if you're just doing whatever on your own strength you're trying to do for injustice because your goal is salvation of self. You're trying to do a works-based salvation. Let me kind of unpack some more of his letter. I think there's a lot more discipleship here. He says this, Ignatius says, do not speak of Jesus Christ, yet prefer this world to him. And you say, wait a minute, that sounds exactly like 1 John. Love not this world nor the things of the world. He says, though I am alive while I write you, yet I am eager to die for the sake of Christ. So he doesn't say, I want to die. This is not a masochist type thing. I mean, he says, I am eager to die for the sake of Christ. If this is God's sovereign will, I am eager to be in God's sovereign will. My love has been crucified, and there is no fire in me that loves anything. But there is a living water springing up in me, and which says to me inwardly, come to the Father. I have no delight in corruptible food nor the pleasures of this life. That is exactly what we see in the conversation with the woman at the well in John 4. The Samaritan woman, he talks about this water that you have, you're going to have to keep coming back from it. But if you knew who you were talking to, you would ask him for water. Talking about Jesus, talking about himself as the Messiah, and I will give you living water. And then when the disciples come to them, he says, I have food that you know nothing about. And they say, who gave him food? Here it is. We see Ignatius said this. He says, I have no delight in corruptible food, nor the pleasures of this life. I desire the bread of God. I'm going on what he said. Again, we could see more of John here. where Jesus stands up and he says, I am the bread of God. Eat of my flesh, drink of my blood. Become one with me is what he's saying. He's not talking about literally eat bread and say it becomes flesh, or drink wine and say this is the blood of Jesus, that it became miraculously the blood of Jesus. He's saying he really wants this oneness with God. He wants this absolute unity with God. He says, I desire the bread of God, the heavenly bread, the bread of life, which is the flesh of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, who became afterwards the seed of David and Abraham. I desire the drink, namely his blood, which is his incorruptible love and eternal life. Isn't that beautiful? He says that the blood of Jesus, what that symbolizes, what that represents, is the incorruptible love and eternal life that's in Christ. And we say that it's in the blood, it's in the power of the blood of Christ, that Jesus put forth his blood. There is no forgiveness without the shedding of blood. Jesus shed his own blood, and he's saying that's an incorruptible love that represents eternal life. That's what he's desiring. So that that's one chapter of the letter. If we were breaking that letter into chapters, that's chapter 5, the Epistle of Ignatius to the Romans. So you get the context just from chapter 5 that this Christian life is maybe, and we talk about persecution and suffering, that these guys had a reality, a living reality that maybe we're not tapping into today. Peyton, let me ask you, what does that speak to you about that living reality?
Could you rephrase the question, maybe?
Just as you hear that letter and you hear his passion for the sovereignty of God, even through the most horrible circumstances, which, if you look at this, Trajan's edict to Pliny the Younger became foundational for persecution all the way up to Constantine. And Ignatius' response in this letter became foundational to how Christians respond to that persecution all the way up to Constantine. Could you see, if you read that letter and that was your pastor and he's teaching you how to deal with persecution, could you see yourself having a little different attitude than maybe we've been taught in the church up till today?
Yeah, I'm sure if I saw someone as passionate as he was, I would think a little differently about it. I guess I'm struggling to see if he's like, he's trying to fulfill God's will, but I don't know if he's like asking for death, really, like saying like he would invite wild animals to come eat him. I wasn't sure if you consider that to be in God's will.
Right, so that's a great question. We're going to get a lot, so I'm going to get into Polycarp, and when I get to the disciple, remember there's 2 disciples for John that are historically known as John the Apostle. One was Ignatius, the other one was Polycarp. Polycarp was also a disciple of Ignatius. Polycarp was in his 30s, kind of in his 30s and 40s. During this time, I extrapolated that he was about 39 years old. He was actually my age when this happened to Ignatius. Just using the dates I could get. And I think Polycarp may unpack it a little bit more. But when they said wild animals, that was a form of torturous death that the Romans would put upon their enemies, was to let them be eaten by wild animals. And you can obviously tie that into what we know about the gladiators. And the gladiators were sent out with very rudimentary, the slaves were the ones that they wanted to die, whether it be a slave for entertainment or whether it was a political prisoner, were sent out, and they were given very crude weapons, and they were fought against these heavily armed, very sadistic gladiators who would just chop them to pieces, or they would send out lions and other animals to tear this person to pieces. So that's what he's talking to. He's talking to the cultural situation that he was in, that there was a good reason to believe that he was going to die by the hands of very wicked men, or the executioner, and the executioner would use animals, wild animals. That's where that comes from. And we could think back to Daniel and his circumstances being thrown to lions. So he didn't mean just, I'm going to go in the woods and I hope God sends animals to kill me. He didn't mean it for that. So, I'm going to tell you his death, and then we're going to go on to the next emperor. And I'm not downplaying this at all. I just wanted to try to, in this lesson, talk about at least two of the emperors. If we could talk about another one, it'd be great. But I think this is going to be sufficient for us to digest here. So, the Coptic Church of Alexandria, northern Egypt, actually did record how he died. And they have a tradition that he died by being thrown actually to wild beasts who devoured him and tore him to pieces. And there is actually, if you go to copticchurch.net, you can find their historical documents. And I'm sorry, I keep saying Coptic, but it's actually Coptic, the Coptic Church. This is the historical church of Christians in Egypt. In the Coptic Church, they wrote these words, and I'm just going to read their words. He says, "The pagans were enraged. They seized Ignatius, tortured him with various tortures. They put burning coals in his hands and pressed his hands for about 2 hours." Pretty bad. "They burnt his side with red-hot pitch and burning oil." We can think of John the Apostle. They threw him in a boiling oil. "They combed Ignatius's body with iron combs." They basically ripped the flesh from his body. "When they became tired of torturing him, they cast him into prison, where he stayed for a long time." So they didn't do those things to kill him. They did those things to torture him and then put him in prison. So he had to, at that time, he had to come to a point where he had embraced suffering, because that was a living reality of his culture. That was a living reality of the culture that he knew he was going to be thrown into. It says after he'd been in prison for a long time, it says, "When they remembered him, they brought him out and promised great rewards and then threatened him." This is status quo. If you ever read Torture for Christ by Richard Wurmbrand, and I know you and I have talked a lot about this, this is right on with what they did to Richard Wurmbrand after they had just wore him out. They would bring him, they brought him in, they gave him clean clothes, they gave him a book to read. Of course, it was a communist book, and he had not read for a long time. They really kind of took care of him, and then they changed, and they said, "Oh, we're back to telling you we're going to throw you back in the dungeon again." There's so much to unpack on that if you talk about the story of Thomas Kramer, but I just want to say that this was a very common thing that the communists would do with their prisoners, is they would tell them, "Hey, tomorrow you're being released," and then tomorrow would come and they'd say, "Oh, we changed our mind, we're not going to release you, we're actually going to beat you today." And they would do that all the time. They would give them all these false promises of rewards and then go back to torture them. This is psychological torture. So it says they promised him great rewards and then threatened him. "As he was steadfast in his faith, they threw him to the wild beast, and they devoured him and rendered on him into pieces. He delivered up his pure spirit in the hand of the Lord, whom he loved." So again, Trajan's edict became pivotal and foundational through the rest of the Roman Empire up to Constantine, and Ignatius's testimony, his attitude towards suffering, he had to embrace these things because they were about to become a living reality, and it became pivotal and foundational all the way up until Constantine. Absolutely amazing. Do you have any questions on that, Peyton?
No, there's enough thought for it than I was thinking. So.
Okay.
Also, I don't want to cut you off, but I may just drop out at some point while you're teaching.
No problem. Don't worry about it, man.
But I appreciate it. I appreciate your teaching me. So.
Absolutely, brother. I understand. I know you told me about that. I understand. All right, so now we're going to move into Marcus Aurelius. I talked about Marcus Aurelius earlier. I said that he was known as kind of a very much of a progressive. He was beyond his age. He's hailed. He wrote a book, I guess you would call it a book back then, called Meditations. In meditations, he was seen as enlightened. And I'm going to talk to the statement here and kind of get into that, but I want to read a little bit from his enlightened, because it's going to form some context. So Marcus Aurelius, he reigned in 161. So we're talking only about 50 years after Trajan, a little less than 50 years after Trajan. And Marcus Aurelius, he, in his meditations, I'm going to read a little part of his meditations. He said this. He said, "Think constantly as a Roman and as a man, to do the task before you with perfect and simple dignity, and with kindness, freedom, and justice. Try to forget everything else, and you will be able to do so if you undertake every action in your life as if it was your last, leaving aside all negligence and the opposition of passion and to the dictates of reason, and leaving aside all hypocrisy, egotism, and rebelliousness against your own lot." So this was basically Marcus Aurelius's book of Proverbs. And let's go to the reality about who Marcus Aurelius was. Marcus Aurelius actually constantly sought out the advice of seers. And I'll look at this slide here so I can see what you all guys are looking at right now. He constantly sought the advice of seers before every significant undertaking. He always made sure that there was a sacrifice being made before he took on that undertaking. During the early years of his reign, he seemed to be an endless string of invasions, floods, epidemics, and other natural disasters. Soon, the explanation arose that the Christians were the blame, that they had brought the wrath of gods upon his empire. Oh, so now you see, he was actually a very superstitious man. And superstition in this context means that he was very much devout pagan. He was a worshiper of the pagan gods. So his superstition, not how we mean it today in the same context, but very similar, his superstition meant that he always made sure he followed all the things not to offend gods. You know, he didn't go under the ladder. He didn't step on a crack, right? No, it was a lot more than that. He saw the Christians as the reason for natural disasters because they were offending the gods. So there are some very important martyrs to talk about during his reign. And I'm going to kind of go through them a little differently than they're shown on the screen here. I want to start with Felicitas. This is a beautiful, powerful, wonderful story. Felicitas was a widow, and she was a consecrated widow, which meant that they devoted all their time working for the church, and the church supported them. And there was a situation that came up, and the pagans really saw this woman as someone that needed to be dealt with. So again, going back to Trajan's edict, the foundational edict, they accused her. Okay, so now nobody sought her out, but now that she's been accused, she had to come before the prefect. So we got to think a little bit about the historical context. A prefect, who was the prefect we normally think of, is Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate was a military and civil leader. So she was brought before the prefect, and the prefect he tried to persuade her to abandon her faith. He gave her promises. I think again to Ignatius, how he died. First rewards, we'll set you free, take care of you, we understand you're a widow, and then that turns into threats. Alright, if you don't do this, we're going to do some things. But she answered his threats with this statement. She said he was wasting his time. And I'm going to quote her here. She says, "While I live, I shall defeat you. And if you kill me in my death, I shall defeat you all the more." While I live, I shall defeat you, and in my death, I shall defeat you all the more. She's saying, if I'm living, it's Christ, and when I die, you're going to see that my testimony, my witness, martyrio, is going to go forth, and it's going to make a huge impact. And obviously it has, because we're still reading those words till today. So there was the foundation of Trajan's edict, and there's the foundation of Ignatius. What happened is he said, I know I'm going to deal with her. He tried to persuade her children. She had 7 sons. And she encouraged them to stand firm in the faith. And finally, her situation was sent. So you can kind of think of Paul here. He appealed to Caesar. So her situation was sent to Marcus Aurelius. Oh man, well, obviously Marcus Aurelius, he's a progressive. He let's read again his words, those beautiful words he said in his meditations. He said, try to forget everything else, and you will be able to do and take every action in your life as it was your last, leaving aside all negligence and the opposition of passion to the dictates of reason, and leaving aside all hypocrisy, egotism, and rebelliousness against your own lot. So did he take this on like it was his last? Did he leave aside negligence? Did he leave aside opposition of passion? Meaning don't act on passion, instead act on reason? Did he leave aside hypocrisy, egotism? What was for him, his self, ego meaning self? Did he leave that aside? Well, we find out what happened is Marcus Aurelius actually said, take her 7 sons, bring them to 7 cities. And remember, if you read through Acts, you find out a lot of these cities were dedicated to gods. Bring them to these different cities that represent gods, torture them, and execute them in front of the people in those cities. That was Marcus Aurelius' answer here. Torture the sons of an innocent woman, innocent sons of an innocent woman, in cities to appease gods that you think are unhappy with you, and thus they are causing issues like floods. Yeah, what a progressive, what a very, right? So you kind of see where I'm coming from now, Peyton. You kind of see that Marcus Aurelius maybe was not the progressive genius of his time, that maybe there was, he did not really follow his own advice.
Yeah, I can see that.
So if you hear that name, Marcus Aurelius, Emperor Marcus Aurelius, remember, this is what he did. And that was one of several martyrs, and I want to pay homage to in respect to these other martyrs. I want to get to Polycarp. I know that's the big one right here. That name really sticks out because of the writings of Polycarp, because of him being a disciple of John as well. But before I get to him, I want to talk to Justin. We always hear you probably have heard the name Justin Martyr. Have you ever heard the name Justin Martyr before?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, so his name really wasn't Justin Martyr. His name was Justin, and he was a martyr. So he was Justin the Martyr. Okay? Justin, remember we talked about last time about you could go to school and be trained up in rhetoric. Well, Justin was a philosopher, and he was trained up in philosophy, and he became a Christian, and he became what I would say one of the first major apologists of the Christian faith. And those writings, a lot of those writings have survived, which is amazing. It gives us a lot of great perspective of what was going on, how they were attacking the Christian church, and they had these attacks like Christians were eating babies, they were sacrificing babies, they were drinking blood. They took all the things that we take, like in communion, that we are celebrating the death and resurrection of Christ, that Christ was a baby, that Christ said, break this bread that you're breaking represents my body. This grape juice that you're drinking represents my blood. They took those things as literal. They had agape feasts. Christians would have agape feasts. Agape feasts, we would call them probably a fellowship gathering in our church nowadays, where you just get a bunch of Christian believers together. We share stories. We talk about what God's doing in our life. And we normally at some point will have a message that's shared that's to edify us. Maybe we do communion, and it's really a great thing. That was an agape feast. Well, they took it as an eros feast, meaning that the Christians will come together and have these huge sexual orgies. And so Justin would write these apologetics for those things, explaining what they were, giving a proper context, but then he was also on the defense and the offense for the Christian faith, pointing out the problems in their own belief system and why they should turn to the one true God. Well, he had a debate with a pagan, and he really disseminated him. I mean, really just knocked out this opponent. I mean, it was a great debate. He won the debate. So what does the opponent do? Going back to Trajan's edict, he accuses Justin, and Justin is martyred. So hence, Justin the martyr. So the significance of that is, again, we're under Marcus Aurelius here, is that there was a big persecution that birthed out of this. And through that persecution, they began to just have these wild mobs, these wild riots of mobs that would just go find Christians and follow the edict, start accusing them, but then they started doing what's called street justice, where they didn't try to bring them to the courts because they knew the courts were just going to go and persecute them and punish them. So they said, hey, if the courts are going to do it, we can do it. And so they, let me kind of fast forward here. They got to one place, and I'm going to fast forward. I don't want to go through all the details. We can talk about it later if you're interested. But they got to a place, and they found this man named Sanctus. And they began to torture Sanctus for being a Christian. And the more he was tortured, he would just say these words. They would say, how do you, they would do something horrible to him, and he would say, I am a Christian. And they said, we'll show you. And they would do some horrible thing to him, and he would say, I'm a Christian. And they would do another horrible thing. Are you ready to recant? Are you ready to praise Zeus? Are you ready to praise the emperor? Are you ready to hail Caesar? I am a Christian. And he stood firm through all this horrible torture, saying the words, I am a Christian. He became such an inspiration to the crowd that there were some that were so scared of torture, and they said, I don't think I can do this. They said, forget that. You know what? I am a Christian. And then people stood up and said, I am a Christian. Even ones that had kind of wilted in the moment, they stood up and said, I am a Christian. And they were martyred that day. They were killed that day because of his testimony, saying, I am a Christian. And the outcome of that was that they brought so many Christians in, and there are pictures, and I'm going to show you a picture of that. This is not going to be easy to see, but I'm going to show you this picture. If you can see that, that is bodies right there, lined up. And this is an old picture, and what it's trying to demonstrate, let me get in close there, what it's trying to demonstrate is that during this time with Sanctus, right after Justin was martyred, these wild mobs grabbed so many Christians that there were believers that were stuffed in a room with other believers waiting their execution, waiting to be tortured and execution. They just died from waiting. Not because it took a long time, because there was no more air in the rooms. Because they had stuffed so many people in these rooms. It makes us think of what? It makes us think of the Nazi concentration camps. Makes us think when they put all these people in gas chambers, and the Nazis hailed themselves because they found ways to have mass executions. They loaded up Jews on trains to bring them to places where they were only there for one reason, to die as soon as they got there. And if you ever get a chance to visit the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., I highly encourage it. It will definitely deal with you how God's people are dealt with. There's rooms full of hair, there's rooms full of shoes. They all belong to someone, and they were killed just because of their allegiance to the one true God. So the final person we come to is Polycarp. Polycarp's testimony is he was brought before a proconsul. Same kind of thing. He was accused of his faith. The tradition tells us that Polycarp, when they sent the Roman detachment to go take him, that the Roman detachment, they actually, he got there and he said, can I pray before you take me? And they saw that he was an older man at this time. He was 86 years old. And they said, yeah, you can pray. He begins to pray, and as he's praying, these devout Roman soldiers, centurion even, become so convicted that when he gets done praying, they're like, we can't take you. And he says, no, we're going to go. He says, again, he's a disciple of Ignatius. He's not going to shy away. Now, let me give you a little bit of background there. Initially, before this happened, there was another older man named Germanicus. Germanicus was accused. He was brought to trial, and the magistrate over the trial says, hey, recant and you won't be tortured. You're an older man. Look, we'll let you go. And he says, no, I'm not going to do that. And so what they told him is they said, and let me deal with this. This is a great thing. He said, I would rather die than live in this kind of injustice, where you can just accuse people, take them to trial and kill them. I would rather die than live in injustice. So are Christians devoted to injustice? It's so embedded within us that we don't want to live in this injustice, that we want to deal with this injustice, that we're willing to lay down our lives for it. Absolutely. We're willing to go through suffering because of it, because it is one with us. We are one with justice, and we can't stomach injustice. So in his act of courage, it aroused a mob, and they started shouting, death to the atheist, death to the atheist. And then they said these words, bring out Polycarp. Remember we said last time, atheist was the person that worshipped an invisible God. Atheist is a person that didn't worship the polytheistic pagan gods. That's what they said. You are atheist. You are against God if you don't worship Zeus and all the other polytheistic gods. You're an atheist. So when Polycarp was originally told, hey, they're coming after you, he hid. He did hide. And he had to spend some time with God. And they found him, and then he hid again, and they found him, and then he didn't even try to hide again. He said, look, if they found me, this is God's will. I've got the confirmation I need. If they're finding me, I know this is the sovereign will of God. And he never backed down from that point forward. Once he knew it was the sovereign will of God, he never backed down. So they bring him to the court case, and this is so cool. The proconsul tried to persuade him to worship the emperor, said, hey, look, you're old, look at you, go and worship the emperor, get out of this, you're 86 years old. And he said these words, the judge looked at him and said, I need you to shout these words, out with the atheist. Now what the judge wanted him to do is he wanted him to look at all the Christians and basically talk to the Christian worldview. That's wrong. The Christian worldview is wrong. He's recanting of Christianity. So what he does, Polycarp is so settled and at peace with what's going to happen that he looks at the crowd of pagans and he says, you're right, out with the atheist, pointing to the crowd of pagans. He says, you guys are the ones that are atheists. You are against God because I know the one true God whom you don't know. And so the judge sees that this act, he starts saying, look, I just need you to curse Christ. I need you to worship the emperor and curse Christ. And to this, Polycarp says these words. He says, for 86 years I have served my king, and he has done me no evil. How can I curse my king who saved me? I want to say that again. Let it just sink in. For 86 years I have served my king, and he has done me no evil. How can I curse my king who saved me? And the story goes on that they took Polycarp and they nailed him, or they tied him to a stake. He said, you don't need to tie me to a stake. I'm 86 years old. I'm all right. I'm not going anywhere. So they put him in a stake and they went to burn him. And if you see the picture here that you're looking at, you see that he's at a stake, but you don't see any fire. Instead, you see this guy down with a blade or a knife or something pointing at him. It says that the fire would not burn him. It enveloped around him. That the fire went around Polycarp. And it wouldn't burn him. So the executioner got mad, grabbed a dagger, and ran up and manually murdered him, or killed him, executed him. I call it murder because he wasn't guilty of anything. And so I want to wrap up this lesson with these believers. Yes, they saw the reality of the worst suffering in the world. And they never lost sight of the Great Commission. They continued to edify the church. They focused on converts and disciples. They focused on the miraculous presence of God. We just talked about the fire wouldn't even touch Polycarp. Ignatius, he questioned if the wild beasts would even come against him because he knew the stories that the wild beasts wouldn't touch, that animals knew better than to touch believers. They knew the miraculous presence of God would bring them through whatever faced them. They believed in the sovereignty of God, and if it was God's sovereign will, God would bring them through whatever. And they focused on that suffering alongside Christ shows that we're a co-heir of Christ, and we will have the full inheritance of His glory. So I'm going to close this lesson. Next time we pick up, we are going to talk about several other emperors. One is Valerian, and things kind of changed under Valerian, and the other one's Decius. We're also going to talk about, well, I may not get to those because I want to focus in on Septimius Severus. Septimius Severus, we are going to get to Decius, we are going to get to Valerian, I don't want to be wrong, get your who are those guys, and then never talk about them. We will get to them, but we really need to talk about Septimius Severus. Now we're talking about Tertullian. So this was who Tertullian was dealing with, as well as with Marcus Aurelius. This was Tertullian's life. What was Septimius Severus looking for? We're going to talk about Irenaeus. We're going to talk about the story of Perpetua. If you've never heard the story of Perpetua, please read her letter. It will so much encourage you. I'm going to deal with a lot on Perpetua. We're going to talk about Maximus the Thracian. We're going to talk about Decius, and I think I'm saying his right name wrong. I think it's Decius, actually. It's kind of typical when you read these names in English. Well, Greek is very clear, but the English pronunciation, we use E in different ways. So hopefully it's been edifying that in persecution, there is a living reality. These guys went through things that are so horrible and embraced it all the way to the end, where their executioner said that guy was really the real deal. He had such a pure heart. God bless you, and thank you for this opportunity.